Yeah, welcome to our roundtable, Sexual Harassment and Violence in Higher Education. I'm very happy to be here today with all of you. And we will dive into the topic. And we asked you to start with an intro statement. And these questions were about why you are dealing with the topic of sexual harassment and violence, and how did you come to work on this topic. And I would like to ask Catherine first to make her statement.
Hi there. Thanks very much, Heike. Well, I came to work in the university in 2009, and I came to work in the National Centre for the Protection of Older People, which conducts research into elder abuse. From there, I went on to work with student groups that are underrepresented in higher education, such as mature students, low-income students, students with a disability, and students seeking international protection. And through my work with these groups, I was accepting disclosures of sexual misconduct, harassment, and violence. And I was witnessing firsthand the shortfalls of the university's response to these behaviours at that time. Then in 2019, our university commenced a review of its dignity and respect policies. And following analysis of the feedback from that review process, some very clear themes emerged in terms of support in this area. And the feedback suggested that dedicated roles should be appointed to provide confidential and proactive support to those disclosing issues of sexual violence, sexual harassment, and also bullying and harassment. And it was decided that these roles should offer support for people who are reporting these issues, but also those who have been reported for these issues. And the role should guide and proactively support individuals going through the informal and formal processes and be there to provide aftercare for as long as is needed. So I saw this as my opportunity to contribute. I applied for the position to establish and manage the new service, and thankfully I was successful. And we launched our service in November 2021. But I think it's so important because it's only by providing a safe and respectful and stress-free environment that we can support everybody in our community to utilise their skills and to achieve their full potential. And it's really clear that universities have a crucial role to play in addressing these issues of sexual violence and sexual harassment and working to change culture on a societal level around these issues. And I really wanted to be part of that. So that's how I came to take up this role.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That's great. Jen, do you want to continue?
Thank you. My journey is probably a little bit longer in that I was an activist in my early days prior to going to university, and I worked in women's refuges. So I was really keenly aware of gendered violence. And then as part of my university degree, I did a clinical internship in sexual assault. So I graduated and I decided to work as a sexual assault counsellor, then got into the university and further postgraduate work. So when I came to the university, I had a reputation as being both an activist, but also deeply committed to the researching of gendered violence. And I suppose, how did I get involved most specifically with this was my entry was with staff. I ran a large project, a national project in Australia where we worked with the Australian Council of Trade Unions to embed industrial clauses in agreements around domestic and family violence leave. Then we moved to sexual harassment. So my entree was with staff, but I started to think, why not students? And in 2015, across all of Australia, students became very, very active and really wanting universities to respond and to stop accepting really dreadful behaviour and not providing the support to keep students in their program of study. So I worked a lot with students. I'm a head of school, so I took a lot of disclosures. But at that time, I think our Gendered Violence Research Network, which I co-convene, were given the responsibility to set up a reporting portal. So we set up a reporting portal. We gave advice about what would be a good practice response. And we started, how we started, and we responded to all of the surveys that were done. nationally in every university. So it's a circuitous route for me. It is through practice, but it's also through research that I've sort of come to be in a position now where this is a really primary area for me to respond to as part of my job.
Great. Thank you very much, Jan. Pater, would you like to continue?
Thank you, Heike. It is not very common in India or I think anywhere else in the world for men to be involved in research, training, or sensitization programs regarding sexual harassment and violence. So I think my own journey on this topic has been quite interesting, and it was quite serendipitous as well. So 1997 was an important year regarding sexual harassment and violence in India, because the Supreme Court of India came up with a very important judgment and a set of guidelines to address sexual harassment and violence in the workplace. And that was the year that I and a colleague of mine, who is now Professor Rowena Robinson, we joined the Indian Institute of Technology in Mumbai. And we felt that there was a very important need to address sexual harassment and violence and introduce gender sensitization programs in the institute, because it was completely absent at that time. But we were still on a contract basis, and we were very junior faculty at that time, and there was not much we could do. But fortunately, in the year 2000, a new director was appointed to the institute, and his partner was a very well-known women's rights as well as child rights activist. And she encouraged us to work on this theme. And so we initially started by conducting a workshop for non-teaching employees and for faculty on gender sensitization. And then we subsequently developed a gender sensitization module, which was made mandatory for all postgraduate students in the institute. Then following the Supreme Court judgment, all organizations in India were asked to set up a women's cell to process and address sexual harassment cases in their organizations. So I and my colleague were asked to be members of that committee, which set up the first ever women's cell in our institute. And as part of that, we interacted with women's rights activists and those who had experience of addressing sexual harassment in different parts of the city, in other universities in India. And gradually, this led to my involvement in several of these programs. And then for the last 20-25 years, I've been conducting, designing gender sensitization modules, as well as training programs on addressing sexual harassment in universities as well as in the corporate sector. So that's been my journey on this topic.
Thank you very much for sharing it with us. So Wendy, I think it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you. And hello to everyone. Yeah, my journey is different than yours, but every journey has been different so far. Very interesting. I think I started my journey when I was a gender equality officer. This is an office which is common at every German university, and I was a gender equality officer at one institute. And part of the work for gender equality officers is also to somehow deal with sexual harassment and violence. Whatever this means in particular was not so clear. But somehow this is part. And then I joined the team of the Chief Gender Equality Office. I became deputy there. And so I started counseling victim survivors of sexual harassment, and also got involved in preventive work, awareness measures, and all of that. And as I said before, it's not like that it's very clear what the duties are, but somehow gender equality officers do it. And that's also how it was in my case. But it was so important and interesting for me that I started to take over more and more of counseling work and also of preventive work on sexual harassment and violence. So in our team, I became, let's say, the person who did the counseling of victim survivors. And I got myself some training as much as I could get. And I started also to train gender equality officers, how to counsel victim survivors. And yeah, that's actually my way of coming into this, into this work and into this position that I'm doing at the moment. I also became part of a standing working group that we have. At first, I was a member of this working group that works on the prevention of sexual harassment. And for a couple of years, I've become the head, more or less, of this working group. So you might understand that it's not like a real clear position still. It's still in the process, and I think I'm shaping it. People around me are shaping it. And if you would meet in 1 or 2 years, I probably would say something else, what I'm doing now, what my position is. So, but this has been the development. And for me, this topic is, I think, a personal matter of justice. It's very important for me to support people who are discriminated against. And I find it hard to take that victim survivors are taken out of the system, out of the university, because of their suffering from all of the consequences. And so it's like very important for me to support victim survivors, to empower them, and to try as much as possible to keep them in the system and to allow them to pursue their studies and their work. Yeah.
Thanks, Wendy. So, Javiera, it would be great if you could continue.
Well, I am dealing with the topic of sexual harassment and gender-based violence because of a personal and political commitment. So my view on the subject is that sexual harassment and gender-based violence is a control mechanism over subjectivities, and it's also an exclusion method that generates barriers on social participation and has an effect on worsened social inequality. Particularly in my case, my formal approach to gender issues began during my last year of college, which resulted on me focusing my master's degree thesis on the social meanings of street harassment, which an emphasis on its justification mechanisms of the sexist system. And on my professional career, I began to work on gender issues through activism against street sexual harassment. And then I started to wander through other social problems associated, like, for example, domestic violence, sexual violence, and since 2021, I work on gender-based violence and discrimination in the context of public university, as it is the University of Santiago, Chile.
Yeah, thank you, Javiera. Then I ask Leslie to go on, please. Leslie.
Okay, my name is Leslie Johnston, and I manage a team called the Equally Safe Team, which is based at Edinburgh University. I came into this post 3 years ago. I've got a long history since I graduated from Edinburgh University myself in social policy and criminology. I've got a long history of working around gender-based violence and domestic abuse, rape and sexual assault. And I was already doing some work with the university in my previous post, when I was gender-based violence lead for NHS Lothian. And prior to that, I'd worked for the Scottish Government, and I'd worked in various third sector organisations, Women's Aid, Shelter, a number of different organisations and council. So I've worked across all the different sectors that are possible to work in Scotland. And a post came up at the university, which, as far as I was aware, was a very, very new, innovative post. And that was in recognition that there were a lot of reported cases which were being disclosed to staff members and also to the police, primarily around levels of sexual assault. And what we were seeing was that lots of people were reporting being sexually assaulted by students, by the wider community, and that the university were struggling a little bit to know how to respond to that, and that staff were not trained or necessarily supported to deal with such disclosures. And there was a recognition that because of the nature of the abuse that was taking place on the university campus, that this was having a huge impact, a very, very negative impact on the students whom it affected, and also in terms of the safety and the perceived safety on campus. So I applied for the post and started this post 3 years ago.
Okay, thank you, Leslie, and thank you everybody for the first round. So we are going on to the second round, and I would start with Jan and ask you, since when has the topic of sexual harassment violence been relevant in your university, and how has it developed, and what resistance has there been? What support was important for you?
To be truthful, all Australian universities have been aware there have been really significant issues of sexual harassment and sexual assault that have been reported in our press for very, very many years. And I think part of the problem is that for a very long time it was, well, boys will be boys, and, you know, this is all part of hazing and university life, and people are being sensitive, or it's just part of getting to know one another. There are lots of excuses that have been made for very many years. And I think we started to become more active in Australia around 2011. But again, most of the activity came from students. And I think that's a strong feature of the way in which our responses have developed. And also a criticism in that staff maybe haven't engaged enough, so that all of our response efforts are around the experience of students and preventing sexual harassment and sexual assault for students. And it's only in the past year that our university has actually changed that particular perspective. But back in 2011 and also in 2015, our National Union of Students ran sexual violence surveys. And really what they wanted to do was to capture actual experiences and consolidate all that we actually really knew about sexual violence and other safety concerns. And then an initiative that came to us, and it actually was UNSW driven, which is my institution, was called the Hunting Grounds Australia Project, which looked at a particular DVD that had been made in America and showed some of just the very worst of sexual harassment and sexual violence that took place, particularly in college settings. Now, we then managed to receive funding from University Australia to work with our Human Rights Commission to investigate more concerns and across all of Australia and all universities. And we had people were allowed to retrospectively report their experiences. And this was conducted throughout 2016. And then the report, which was called Change the Course, was released in 2017. And that report probably is the first time where recommendations were taken by Universities Australia and our regulatory body, which we call TEXA for some reason, developed what was called a good practice note. So universities had to comply, and that, I think, the regulation of sexual harassment and sexual assault with students was a really important landmark for us. We've always had the capacity to report sexual harassment as staff members, albeit limited by people's fear of retribution and, you know, that they may not be promoted, that nothing will happen, all of the things that happens with that. But the student-led activism really had our university in particular looking to see what it could do better and what it could do more of. And so one of the things that we worked on was trying to see if we could help people report both sexual harassment and sexual assault, all kinds, the spectrum, the continuum between. And for us, it meant developing a reporting portal that students felt was trauma-informed, sensitive, compassionate, provided information about referral, and allowed them to consider whether they wanted to make a report or whether they wanted to make a complaint that could possibly be investigated by our Conduct and Integrity Unit. So those were very important initiatives, but it probably wasn't until, I would say, even a couple of years ago that we started to talk about prevention. And I think it's interesting, and I'm sure most of my colleagues on this round table would agree, that when these kinds of incidents are in the media, the university will act very strongly. They are very reactive to any kind of criticism about their management or allowing us an unsafe environment to exist for students, because it can affect potential student recruitment. So we started very strong, and it wanes over time. But I think back in 2018, when we established our first standalone sexual misconduct prevention and response policy, that started to look more at what we needed to entrench within the university. Now, my colleagues and we have been involved in the reporting portal since 2017, when we helped develop and establish it. We've provided training for all of the university staff who are providing a response, and we've looked much more recently at e-learning and different training modules so that there's some kind of sustainability, because students turn over all the time, and so do staff. And we have developed some very specific gendered misconduct training modules as well. But alongside is the other project where we've worked really consistently around staff rights to have domestic and family violence paid leave, and to have flexible work arrangements. And I've been involved working with our federal Commonwealth government around how to manage the new sexual harassment laws that came in last year after, again, more inquiries. So one of the things that we've done, which I think is very different, is that we have shifted from sexual harassment and sexual misconduct to gendered violence. In part, that reflects our government's national plan, which talks about gender-based violence or gender violence, influenced, of course, by the UN. And we have a really strong focus on looking at both students and staff, which is probably the first time where we've consolidated what we've done to say that everyone has a right to feel safe and supported and to receive a best practice response. And we created the first gendered violence policy, standalone policy, back in 2022, which has been launched with an action plan. So we're back on some kind of track. But again, it's always precarious. And I suppose this gets into the type of resistance. Resourcing is always a challenge. I spoke with our Vice-Chancellor when he responded to some of our national survey results around experiences of sexual violence in the university. And when we told him what we thought we would do with the policy, the one comment I kept making to him was, but this takes resourcing. And he kept saying, I'll find the money, don't worry. But that's always such a precarious position to be in, because when money isn't found or it's taken from another area, or you get a little bit but not a lot, you can end up with responses that in theory are fantastic, but you haven't got the resources to manage them. And universities' commitment dwindles over time. Other things will come up, and those things will take priority over the things that you've been negotiating and expecting will continue. I think gendered violence, was a really clever shift for us, because it encompasses so many different behaviours that are on a spectrum of gender abusive behaviour. And particularly in our institution, we've seen a real uptake, particularly by students, surprisingly enough, in asking for assistance with domestic and family violence, or dating violence for some, and our staff. So that shift has been important in that regard. It allows us to think about how gender influences and shapes behaviours, and that, if we start off with hazing where college seniors ask, first years to run up the hill without their tops on, that is probably not a joke, and it is serious, and it can lead to a desensitization for people that these things are expected in college and they'll continue to happen. So we've worked, I think, very hard to get senior leadership support. I think that's critical. I think in our university, one of the biggest issues has been what's in scope and what's out of scope, and how do we manage online abusive behaviours and sexual harassment. It's often not clear if the person hasn't used a university IP address, is that our responsibility? So there are lots of issues around scope that I think all universities have to really think about. COVID-19 was tricky. We saw a sharp increase in online stuff, but a drop in face-to-face reports. And again, I think with staff, I think it's critical that staff are involved. It's critical that they're part of a co-design, and I think everything should be co-designed with staff and students, frankly. But when they're absent from the discussions, and when their views about what's difficult, what's not difficult, what they would like, what would be a helpful response, when those views are not garnered, then it's not really a whole of institution or a whole of community response. So there are lots of things that I think we've done very well, but I think it is still a precarious position to be in. And I suspect that one of the keys is regulation from Universities Australia or a like body in other countries, that will be an important part of keeping universities honest in this regard.
Yeah, thank you. And was there any kind of support you consider especially as important for the issue at your institution? Sometimes it's from an actor you don't expect to be supportive.
Our Vice-Chancellor both Vice-Chancellors who I've worked with have personally been very committed to the issue, and in part it is because they are so well aware of the reputational damage should students go to the press. So I think it's definitely a personal commitment, and our current Vice-Chancellor is incredibly committed. But it's an area of risk, and you don't want to leverage that type of risk too much because you want the commitment to be genuine. But it's one of the things that does get resourcing where they feel that there's going to be an issue. So I guess senior leadership, I think it's helped. I think that the GVRN, while we're a research network, all of us have worked in the field in some ways. We have lawyers, we have social workers, psychologists, we have a range of different disciplinary experts, all of whom are now researching. But it means that when the university has had, and we've had some really complex cases, we probably do have the experience to help them manage it in a way that has been beneficial for them. And also we know how to refer. We've got good external contacts through our research and our past practice. So I think that's helpful. And I think just transparency, being prepared to say where we get it wrong and talking with students about where we get it wrong and making sure that co-design process is genuine and ongoing. And I think it's the ongoing that's hard with all of this. I don't think it's always that hard to initiate a very specific action or idea, but keeping it going, keeping it resourced when there's just such scarce resources, because we were decimated with COVID-19 in relation to our budgets. So everything was a priority for everybody, and it was really difficult to maintain those resources.
Okay, thank you, Jen. So I will hand over to Partha to share your experiences. Please, Partha, go ahead.
I'd like to start by talking about the context of our institution, which is somewhat different from a regular university. So ours is an Indian Institute of Technology, one of several such institutions of eminence. And as a largely technical university, historically, there has been a dominance of males, both among professors and among students. So the number of women were very small, which meant that there was largely a culture of silence around issues of sexual harassment and violence. And there was also a hesitation to take up these issues with the leadership of the institution for a very long time in the history. So as I was saying earlier in my introduction, about 20 years ago, this began to change, partly because of the encouragement of the Supreme Court of India and government agencies at the national level, which are bringing in new laws to address sexual harassment at the workplace. So there, in our own institution, there was an overall absence of any kind of gender sensitization programs, no support systems whatsoever for people who suffered or were affected by sexual harassment. There were no mechanisms to deal with complaints of sexual harassment and violence. Moreover, the general language that we observed at that time, whether in formal communications, informal communications, in teaching, as well as in the various kinds of regulatory systems and forms that were used, for example, all of these were completely gender insensitive. Now, this gradually began to change about 15, 16 years ago, when as part of a conscious policy of the institution and the policy of the government of India, the number of female faculty and the number of female students in engineering began to go up. And this naturally brought in a lot of resistance from the men, and cases of sexual harassment and violence also began to go up around 15 years ago. And so using what is well known in India as the Vishaka judgment of the Supreme Court of India, which first time laid down guidelines for prevention of sexual harassment, we began to set up a women's cell and also gender sensitization programs around 20 years ago. Subsequently, around 2010-11, the Parliament of India passed what was initially called as the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act, which eventually became known as the Sexual Harassment at the Workplace, Prevention of Sexual Harassment Against Women at the Workplace Act. And these then required setting up of formal procedures and protocols for filing complaints of sexual harassment, and then procedures to investigate these cases and recommend appropriate action against the perpetrators of sexual harassment. So this development at the national level was also mirrored in our own institute, and I was part of these processes, including the setting up of the very first women's cell. So there was a committee set up with a senior professor and the partner of our director, who was, as I said earlier, a women's rights activist. So I and a couple of other colleagues were members of this committee, which set up the first ever women's cell in our institution. Subsequently, there have been a lot of key developments, and I'll just mention 3 or 4 of these. First is that we started out with a mandatory module on gender sensitization in communication and sexual harassment for postgraduate students in our institution. About 3 years ago, this was made mandatory for all students and faculty as well. Then there has been an affirmative action program in place, which sought to increase the number of women in engineering streams substantially to at least 33% of the total number of students. And so these increased numbers meant that we also needed more female faculty to mentor these students to address issues of sexual harassment. There was an important shift here, where earlier female faculty saw their duties to address sexual harassment as a burden because it was taking them away from their own research and teaching careers. Gradually, more women, senior women, began to get involved in working with the women's cell and what became known as the gender cell later, to shaping systems for complaints, creating resources that could be used by women students and faculty members, creating appropriate protocols and procedures which are customized to the Indian context, and so on. And then finally, what happened was that because sexual harassment was not being faced only by women, and LGBTQ issues became very important to address as well. Also, there were issues of intersectionality, where women who had a higher status in terms of caste or class were also harassing women who were from a different social background. And so the women's cell was made into a gender cell, and we're still trying to work out how exactly to make use of the gender cell to benefit or address the complaints of a wide range of different kinds of individuals affected by sexual harassment. Naturally, this brings me to the second question. What kind of resistance has there been and what kind of support has been important in addressing increasing cases of sexual harassment? So like Jan was saying, largely in our institution as well, the leadership, who is the director equivalent to the vice chancellor, has been supportive of the gender cell, the women's cell, and cases of sexual harassment. I know there have been cases where individuals have been suspended, removed from the institution, and so on. But the problem is actually at a lower level, where at the level of an individual administrative or an academic department, that is where cases get suppressed before they even go to the gender cell or to higher levels. And that is where there is a paucity of leadership of women who can look into these cases, because it's largely men who are heads of these departments. We've also seen resistance from some groups of students, because these are students who come from particular social backgrounds of privilege, backgrounds of upper caste status, backgrounds where they have not been socialized into thinking about the issues of sexual harassment. They take it for granted that this is how men should behave. And so these issues of intersectionality have been very difficult to address. And that is something on which a lot of thinking and a lot of training, a lot of mentoring has been required for people involved in the gender cell to address these kinds of issues. Technically, the government of India is supposed to provide financial resources that Jan spoke about as well, and that has been not forthcoming as well. So there is some resistance from the government. So there is a law to prevent sexual harassment, but the resources to implement this law has not been forthcoming, because of which the gender cell and the ICC, that is the Institute Complaints Committee, have not been able to work or function to their optimal level. Now, how do we address this? How do we prevent this resistance or overcome this resistance? There has been support from the directors. There has been support from some of the senior female faculty who now have decided that it is high time that they invest more time and along with the other kinds of burdens that they already have. And so, because of the increasing cases of sexual harassment, the presence of women in leadership positions, both in the gender cell but in the administration in general, that has made a significant difference in increasing the awareness and support for addressing sexual harassment issues. Another significant support has come from younger faculty. So there's a significant generational shift that we can see. So the older generation of faculty were much more resistant to training, to mainstreaming gender issues. The younger faculty are much more supportive of this. As a result of which, we also see that many of these younger faculty have been part of movements against violence against women, against sexual harassment in other universities. And they have been much more supportive of students to bring up these complaints so that they can be followed through. And because of this, most students are now willing to come forth and file their complaints and follow it through. And that, I think, is a positive sign, which sends out particular kinds of signals to the perpetrators of sexual violence that this is not acceptable, that there will be action taken against them. We still have a long way to go, but I think at this stage, there is much more support for addressing sexual harassment and violence than it was about 20 years ago.
Thank you, Partha. Thank you very much for ending this first round with on a positive note, actually. And thanks to both of you, Jan and Partha, for sharing the insights about your institutions, about your work, and the resistance and support. It was really interesting to hear about it. So we are going to the second round, and I'm asking now Wendy and Catherine, and I will start with Wendy. Wendy, what measures and tools have been developed to deal with sexual harassment and violence, and what resources are there for this at your institution?
Thank you, Heike. Well, let me start first to say that we have some tools, we have some measures, and there are some resources, but what we don't have is a clear strategy on the structure on how to fight, how to work against sexual harassment and violence. So what I can offer you now is more or less a list of things that we have, and I will do that. But as I said, there needs to be a concept, there needs to be a strategy, and this is something we certainly don't have at this point. So let me start. We do have guidelines on sexual harassment and violence. They have been in effect since 2015, and we have also renewed them. And I think they're a good basis for our university to have a first understanding of what sexual harassment and violence actually means. It is also important because we have a clear statement from the university that it is not okay, that we have to protect victim survivors, and that everyone is in charge, everyone is responsible to take a stance against it. And even more so people who have responsibilities for others, like teachers, professors, people in HR and so on. And so I think it's very good that we have these guidelines, but they're just guidelines and they're just paper, and they're more like a theoretical basis and a kind of orientation, I would say. There will be more guidelines very soon. They're in the process of being of becoming in effect on equal chances and on well, like a code of conduct in a guideline, more or less, and they will also include the topic of sexual harassment. So this is like the internal legal basis that we already have, or that is in the process. What else do we have? We have I would say, a resourceful website on sexual harassment and violence. It's called No Means No, and well, it provides all kinds of information on legal matters, on what is it actually, what happens there, a list of points of contact, and some other information on it. And we do have it in English, which might sound normal to you, but actually it is not necessarily normal, because many websites still at our university are only in German, even though there are many non-speaking students, lecturers, and other members of the university that would need an English website. We organize events around November 25th, the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. We have done this for 4 years now, and what we offer are all kind of, let's say, awareness events, like workshops, like discussions like this. We have also a lot of literature, blog articles that are being posted on this day. We offer special counseling hours. So we try as much as we can to, first of all, make this topic known in the university, and also to show that there are some people active in this place. Well, there is material, like awareness material, that we try to distribute. We offer also workshops, and when I say we, this is actually most of the time gender equality officers, especially from the Chief Gender Equality Office, but also from the departments, and also I would say the Margherita von Brentano Center, and that's basically what the we means at this place. So not so much the university management, but all the people that think it is important to do something on this topic. So then, yeah, we organize some workshops, but only a very few, I would say. So when I listen, especially from UGEN, that you have, I don't know, developed online tools or workshops, and this sounds so structural and also so rich in quantity. We have a few, I'd say. Heike and me have started to offer one a year. For employees, especially those with responsibilities for others. And some of our colleagues at the department's gender equality offices mainly, they offer customized workshops, but only on demand. So there is no, there's no like a big workshop, program, but only very few, I'd say. We have, of course, the Margherita von Brentano Center, who has done research on this topic, as you know, and I would say the knowledge gained from research and also from the work with the students and projects is something that we can use and that we did actually use when we well, for example, shape the guidelines or when we talk about other measures. So that's something we can use in practical work. We have, let's say, there is the toolbox, Gender and Diversity, that is also, well, how do I call it? It's like an institution where you can, as a teacher or as a lecturer, can get support on how to make your seminars, your lectures more gender and diversity inclusive. And they also partly have sexual harassment and violence as a topic, and you can get also assistance from there. Yeah. That's more or less about it. When it comes to actual tools and measures, there are some people in place. I can tell you now, I can also talk about later in the second question, but I shall say something to resources. And there are no central resources for that at the moment. As I said before, many work is done by people who themselves think it is important or who understand it's part of their job to work on this topic. So the resources come from basically their time, that they dedicate part of their time that they have for their work on this topic. And so there are hardly any extra resources. And when we talk about material, for example, or workshops, they are often financed by gender equality officers or sometimes by the departments themselves. Yeah, I think, yeah, that's more or less what we have. And as you can see, or as you can listen, we don't have clear procedures. We don't have for complaints. We don't have clear contact points yet when it comes to counseling that receive themselves professional training, that themselves receive supervision and that work together. So all of this is lacking. Also, like clear sanctions, what to do with offenders, and to actually gives out those sanctions. So responsibilities are not clear, procedures are not clear, and yeah, that's where we are at the moment.
Thank you, Wendy. Before we come to the institutional location, I would give Catherine the opportunity to answer. Catherine, how about the measures and tools you have been developed to deal, or have been developed at your institution, and what resources do you have?
Yeah, I think listening to Wendy, it's very interesting. I think we're a little bit further down the line, or a little bit further down this road. We had our review in 2019. So previously we had, you know, dignity and respect policies, but like Jan was saying, they weren't covering everybody in the community. So in 2019, we reviewed those policies, and the review process was really extensive. And it involved, you know, lots of stakeholders and subject matter experts, both from within the university and externally. We actually started in 2019, but the review wasn't actually published until 2021 as a result of COVID, and kind of some delays, and the fact that it was a huge piece of work. And the review published recommendations under 9 different headings. So it was clear there was so much work to do. We actually ended up having to engage a project manager to set up work streams for us and to manage the project to make sure that we got the best of all the expertise that we had. And the policies that resulted were 2 separate policies. So we now have a bullying and harassment policy, and that covers gender-based harassment, and we have a sexual misconduct policy which covers sexual harassment and violence as well. So it's a policy that covers a really broad spectrum, and it's a policy that it is the same policy for students as for employees. So that's really important. Another huge thing that came out of the review process is obviously the establishment of a dedicated support service. So our service has 3 full-time employees whose job it is to offer support in this area. It's the first service of its kind in the Irish 3rd level sector. And the advisors are offering specialist information, guidance and support to students, employees, and it also covers other community members. So people, for example, cleaning staff who are working in our community, or people who are employed by the restaurants, or the services, sports services and so forth that are offered on our campus are also covered and protected by the policy, which is really great. So the service provides for support in the informal space, if that is wanted and appropriate. And we find often people do want to explore informal resolution options, particularly when it comes to issues of image-based sexual abuse, which we find you know, happens among our student population more obviously than the employees, but it is something that needs immediate response, and people want the image down or some action taken immediately. Our policy allows for informal resolution options, and also to reach informal resolution and then, you know, make a formal complaint further down the line if that's what people want. For various reasons, you know, people might want to just have an informal resolution and work on a formal complaint at a later date, after an exam period maybe, or after a promotion has gone through, or something like that. Then the advisors are here to support people through the formal complaints process, and we can give them clarity on the process, and we can give them clarity on all of the possible outcomes, like what are the disciplinary outcomes. And we are gathering our information and publishing our reports. So we had our 2nd annual report we're going to be publishing, and we hope to be able to in time gather enough information that we will be able to safely report what the disciplinary outcomes are at a high level, but at least that people will begin to get confidence that, you know, when reports are made, when complaints are pursued, they are investigated and appropriate sanctions are given. So that is kind of in relation to the service. We also involved in culture change initiatives at the service. So, for example, we are offering workshops to students going out on clinical placements, because that presented as an area where students felt that they didn't have support, or they didn't necessarily make the connection that the supports that are available to me in the university are also available to me when I go out on my placement. So we would have people going to quite remote parts of the country, maybe in veterinary courses or farming placements, and we have people going into clinical sites where it's very high pressured environment. And it's important that our students know that they can still access the supports of the university when they're out there at that removal. So we have embedded so far into 5 different programs. So we've become part of the module. So then it obviously becomes mandatory for the students to take it. And it's a dignity and respect workshop that they get in second year before they go out on their placement. And we're hoping to be able to expand on those. The advisors also hold various events through the year. So we offer discussion cafes, which are staff and student events come together to discuss these topics, coffee and conversation, lunch and learn, where we do a kind of 30-minute presentation, and the students have some lunch. So we're also involved in that kind of culture change initiative. We have a university-wide training strategy. So we have developed a 3-tier training strategy. So people who are accepting disclosures, obviously ourselves, the Dignity and Respect Support Service, but we also have Dignity and Respect Support colleagues, where they are offering peer-to-peer support for other employees who are experiencing these issues. We have Dignity and Respect ambassadors, who are student leaders in this area, and Students' Union, various other people who may be accepting disclosures. And we have a high level of kind of 2-day training for those roles that is delivered by the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. Then we also have a specific training for our people managers. So that's a 1-day in-person training for all people managers. We have an employee online module training, which is called, I think, Building a Respectful Culture at UCD, and it's an hour online training. And then for all the students, both incoming students and continuing students, we have an active bystander training program that they take. So then we have another kind of help to us has been support and funding for a university-wide communication strategy. So we've developed a phased communication strategy using a mix of in-person and online channels to highlight the availability of support and to highlight the behaviours that are not appropriate and not acceptable in our community. And the communications collateral is very prominent in the common spaces of the university, in high footfall areas across the university, and certainly outside there's posters on every bin. There is on all the colonnades as you walk down the main spike of the university, and in those high footfall areas we have rolled out that communication strategy to kind of highlight the behaviours and the support. Another tool for us has been the ability to collect data. So we have some mechanisms in place. We have an anonymous reporting tool where people can report in anonymously. And they can also, via that tool, elect to ask for support from a DNR support advisor. So if they do that, we can then contact them directly. At the service, we collect data for when people are coming to report issues to us, and obviously through the formal complaints process that allows us to collect data as well. So that's a good tool for us as well. Yeah, so I think that's kind of the highlights of the tools and the resources that we have available to us in UCD.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, it sounds as if you are really, really further down the road compared to what Wendy told us. That's fascinating, especially the training. You have very varied forms of training. That's really, really good. So we heard about from what you said, but perhaps you can make it clear, how is the topic of sexual harassment violence institutionally located at your institution?
Well, I think, I mean, from what you can tell, we've kind of taken an all-university approach to this issue, and the view has been taken that every member of our community has a role to play, and there is an expectation that they will work to develop this culture that we're trying to achieve, which is one of respect, and acknowledging that we have a very diverse community, and to participate in creating a positive and safe environment for us all. So that's kind of the message that we're giving out to everyone in our community, and that there is an expectation that every person play their part. However, there are responsibilities obviously assigned within the policies, and those responsibilities are assigned right the way up from, you know, the governing authority and the university management team, who are both mentioned in the policy of having a role to play. I think similar to someone mentioned earlier on, we were lucky in that we have a vice president for EDI. He's also a member of the university management team, and has since progressed on to take up the position of registrar in the university, which is the position just next to the president. So that's a real advantage for us and people working in this area, because the university management team they spearhead the development of the policies and the associated support. We have an oversight committee, a Dignity and Respect Oversight Committee, and that consists of key stakeholders from across the university, and it also has external subject matter experts. And it's their job to provide oversight and guidance and enhance transparency around dignity and respect, which is so important. When I first came to the university, if you wanted to make a complaint, you could write it down on a piece of paper and post it in a post box over in the registry building, and it went to who knows, and it was read by who knows, and you know, no one really had any clarity on what happened to it. So we've moved a long way from that point to the point where we have transparency, and we're able to publish our annual reports, and we're able to say we have X number of disclosures, we have X number of formal complaints, and we can track those through the process, and hopefully that will give people confidence to make those formal complaints. We have seen an increase of disclosures and formal complaints since the new policies and the establishment of the service. Certainly for our service, our numbers of the disclosures we have accepted have doubled on last year. And this is just our second year. So we know that the issues are here. We know that the behaviors are being perpetrated. We want to give people the confidence to see what will happen, if it have clarity on the formal complaints process and on the potential outcomes. So obviously our service is the face of dignity, the response. Our service is the face of the university's response to sexual misconduct. But there are other people, other units playing their part. The EDI unit manages the formal complaints process. So if people are getting support from us and they want to make a formal complaint, it's the EDI unit to which the complaint is sent. And then we have an employee relations unit, which manages the investigation process for employees and also the disciplinary process. And there is a kind of mirror unit, the student engagement, conducts, complaints and appeals unit, which performs the same roles for students. It's our colleagues in the cultural engagement unit, which have spearheaded our communications campaign, and they have the kind of skills as marketeers, and they were able to help us to roll out that campaign. We also have a dedicated DNR training coordinator. So while we in this service do offer, these workshops to students, and we help to train volunteer employees, usually dignity and respect support colleagues or members of EDI teams, to help us roll out those preclinical placement modules. The training coordinator was responsible for the development of the in-person management training and the online training. So we have a dedicated role to help us develop and roll out those trainings. So I think it is in a very real and practical way embedded in the university, and there are many, many colleagues playing their part. There are a number of colleagues who are playing their part as part of their role, as a paid role, for example, ourselves. But we also have a lot of colleagues who are working in this space long before we arrived, and who are continuing to work in this space, who are volunteering in various EDI units and volunteering to host discussion cafes, volunteering to train students, volunteering to be available to their peers should they wish to discuss experiences that they've had. Yeah, so that's how we're doing it now. Just keep on moving down the road.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Embedded in the institution, that sounds really great. Thank you so much. Wendy, what can you share with us about the institutional location of sexual harassment violence at your university?
And your university, Heike?
Mine too, yes. Our university.
Our university. Yeah, so in my understanding, it should be located everywhere. So everyone should take responsibility when it comes to sexual harassment and violence. I think that's a prerequisite for this whole honest fight against it. If we look at the institution, I would say that it is the university management, and as our university is a very large university, which is organized in departments, also the management of the departments are the ones who have the most responsibility when it comes to this topic. They are also the ones that should be responsible for gender equality, and in my understanding, fighting for equal chances for all genders, for everyone at the university, includes also fighting against sexual harassment and violence, and this is their responsibility. So, and this is also supported by legislation that we have. Each state in Germany has higher education acts, and this is enshrined there. However, the university management gets support in their work, and especially in their work for gender equality, including sexual harassment, violence. It is gender equality officers that do a lot of work on this topic. As I said before at the very beginning, they're often the first and sometimes even the only points of contact for victim survivors, for people needing information on what to do, who can help any further. And also they're the ones that do awareness work in different kinds. And it has, or it's on the way. Also, as I said before, that there will be a central or an official central contact person. That is going to be me, as, let's say, the official contact person for everyone who wants to be counseled, who wants to know something about it. And it is still in the process. I've said it many, many times. So it is not really official yet, but somehow I already do that. So that's how it works at our university. Yeah, we often start with processes, and then we will see what happens in the end. And this is also part of the process of having more contact points, more points for not just for counseling, but also for taking complaints, which we don't really have at the moment. We do have a complaint office for employees. But when I say office, this is actually too much. It's a person who works in HR and who has also the assignment of taking complaints under the General Treatment Act when it comes to discrimination. And this also includes complaints on sexual harassment at the workplace. However, hardly anyone uses this facility, and I would argue that hardly anyone knows that this actually exists. So that's the situation. Yeah, when it comes to complaints, it is HR, it is our legal office, it is university management who is involved, but it is very individual what happens there. So we have no transparency, and I also mentioned this, we don't have any clear procedures. We don't really know what happens there. What are sanctions? What are measures against offenders? Who approaches the offenders? Is it HR? Is it our president? Yeah, there's not a lot of transparency around it. So this is really very difficult for people like me who consult others, because we cannot really tell the people who come to our office what might happen, what might be the next steps, and what the next handling could be if they really want to make complaints. I think the standing office that we have on the prevention of sexual harassment and violence is part of the, well, we can understand it that it's part of the institutional structure, I would say, because it is a group of people who comes from different parts of the university. Different parts, I mean, different departments, but also from different jobs, different positions. And there's, for example, gender equality officer in it. There's a psychologist. There's someone from HR. It is our vice president on diversity and gender equality who is part of it. And there, this standing group works together on issuing some kind of awareness measures and prevention work against sexual harassment and violence. I would say this is a wrap up of where we have our institutional location on this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy, very much. To me, it seemed as if you are at like very different stages and have very different ways of institutionalizing the topic. Catherine, from your side, to me, it seemed as if there are procedures in place, there's open communication, there is transparency, so everybody knows what's going on, where to go, you know, what is happening. Whereas Wendy is speaking about an intransparent process where nobody knows who is doing something or not, and probably this has very much also effects on the people in your institutions, because when you see that there's a transparent process, there are reports, then you kind of have the opportunity to trust the institution. Whereas when you see that nobody knows what's going on, why would you trust the institution and talk to somebody? It's really interesting, and I really hope that Wendy, you can continue your work and perhaps someday arrive at the point where Catherine is at. It sounds really, really amazing to me. Well, thanks for this round. We are going now to the third round, and I'm happy to speak with Leslie and Javiera. I'm starting with Javiera, and I would like to know, what specifically do you deal with in your field of work?
So to the second question, specifically addressed to describe what I do in my field of work, I can say that the unit of gender diversity and equity of the University of Santiago, Chile has two lines of work. The first one has to do with the transversalization of gender perspective, and on the other hand, another area looks for the eradication of gender-based violence and discrimination. I work on the second one, and in this area of eradication of gender-based violence, we can find two main services. One that seeks to deploy actions to prevent violence and discrimination, and another one that seeks to provide support to victims. I work in the second service called psycholegal support. Thus, the psycholegal support service is a voluntary and confidential service carried out by a specialist lawyer and by me as a psychologist, and it provides accompaniment to victims and gender violence on campus context. So we intervene in crisis, receive complaints through the gender protocol, the legal protocol. We also refer to a specialized institution and provide legal advice regarding associated queries. We also provide guidance to the community on gender perspective, for example, helping managers and authorities to learn about the internal regulations and to create strategies to apply protection measurements to protect victims in their academic or space or workspace. Another aspect worth highlighting is that we work respecting the autonomy and consent in the intervention we carry out. For this reason, for example, it is not a requirement to make a formal complaint to receive psycholegal attention. You just have to seek for help.
Well, thank you, Javiera. Then I will give the floor to Leslie. What specifically do you deal with in your field of work?
Okay, so initially the job breakdown was looking at around about 20% of my time would be dealing with casework, and I would be allocated 2 specialist caseworkers to deal with cases. And then I would also have time for policy, research, training, development, partnership working, because sexual abuse and gender-based violence does not happen in a vacuum. And the majority of students who are at universities and colleges will clearly interact within the wider community. And whilst we see some cases of students being assaulted and abused by other students, other staff members, then we have procedures and processes in place to look at how do we manage that. So we've done a lot of work looking at, well, what are the challenges? What are students telling us? What are survivors telling us? And what survivors were telling us and what student-led bodies were telling us was that there wasn't a clear process for how to report and how to get support. And it was quite patchy across the university. We have 45,000 students. We are a very large university, and there are some fantastic staff who are working and doing a lot of very good work around this area. But it's a very specialist area of work and some very specialist legislation and responses around this area of work. So there's a recognition that actually students need a dedicated team. So my team, I've got background knowledge in this area of work, and we can talk about criminal justice responses, we can talk about police responses, we can talk about what will happen if you make a formal report to the university. We can, what we call signpost or triage students to counselling, we can apply for special circumstances on their behalf, we can take time out if they need it, we can ask our resident life association, which is accommodation service, if the student wants to be moved. So we put our whole package of care in around that student, but the main thing is it's survivor-led. So it's very victim focused. So the first thing we will do is sit down with a student or a member of staff, and we will say, we're very sorry that this has happened to you. This was not your fault. Because every single survivor that I have worked with in this job, and I have worked with hundreds of students in this job, and previous to that, everybody will feel some level of responsibility and guilt. And that comes from how the media presents and reports on sexual violence. And a lot of people will feel, if I hadn't been drinking, if I hadn't been wearing those clothes, if I hadn't invited this person back for coffee, if I hadn't gone back to their apartment or their flat, if I hadn't gone to that nightclub, if I hadn't been so drunk, and there's always reasons that people will feel that they are somehow responsibility, and that can really inhibit their recovery. So what we can do is we can work and say that this wasn't your fault, and we can support you whether you want to report this or not. And we understand that reporting either officially to the police or to the university is a big, big step. And what we're finding is probably very similar to other countries, is we have a very, very big backlog in the court system. In Scotland, rape and sexual assault is considered to be very high profile, high prolific serious assault cases. So they go through what we call the high court system. And the waiting time at the moment to get a case processed is about 3 to 4 years. Okay, so we're talking huge backlog in the criminal justice system. So even if a student decides they do want to report, then it's going to take about a year for the investigation to be concluded. And that's a long time for a young person while they're trying to study. So we'll put supports in place and we'll try and help them with that decision. So we'll work really, really closely with the police, and we actually have a specialist contact with the police, so they will come up in plain clothes if the student wants to talk to the police about what the options are, what the chances are of this case being progressed. And if they don't want to go down the reporting route, then we can work with health services, we can work with a whole range of other services to make sure that the support for that student in place. And if the student's about to graduate or going abroad, then we can also transfer that support somewhere else. It's like a whole package of care, depending on what the student is telling us. So that's what we do. We do case management. We're very busy. We're a very busy team. We work really closely with colleagues across the university. We do lots of training, primarily training other members of staff, because not all students will want to come and see a specialist member of my team. So we'll work with student advisors, we'll work with security staff, we'll work with our Res Life staff, we'll work with the advice place, we'll work with all staff, and we'll put together a very specific training depending on the contact they have with students. We work with our student bodies, our student associations. We do lots of awareness raising. We talk about what is gender-based violence, how does it present to you, how to manage a disclosure. So we've got online courses, and we do face-to-face training as well. And we work really closely with our student societies and our sports societies as well, and we have mandatory training for their presidents and vice presidents. So we do bystander training. We have short modules that we've been sending out to lots of new students, because what we're recognizing is, many students have been sexually abused or affected by forms of gender-based violence before they come to the university, but many will be affected by abuse whilst at the university. So it's around changing that culture and saying, actually, this is not acceptable. This is not an acceptable way to behave. And there will be consequences under our student code of conduct. And we will investigate cases. I don't personally do that because that would be a conflict of interest, but I work closely with the student conduct team who will investigate. And we've done lots of training on trauma-informed investigations. And sometimes the students don't get the outcome that they want, and it's about managing those expectations. The levels of evidence are required, and I think it's difficult for students to understand that. But we'll put in lots of interventions and precautionary measures as well. So if we have a student on campus who has been accused, either through the student conduct system or been accused and the police are involved, then we will put in what we call precautionary measures. And we have a number of students who are actually not allowed to study on campus at the moment. So they may have to take an interruption. So we're making the point that actually this is a criminal activity, and that we will take steps to make sure the campus is safe. And we will actually ask this person not to study, not to go to the labs, not to be on library, not to be in student accommodation. And we'll work closely with that person to make sure they're supported, but we'll also work really closely with the reporting party to make sure that they feel safe on campus. So sometimes it's a balancing act because we have a duty of care to both students here. So it is a complex job. We do lots of research. I'm doing a lot of partnership work at the moment. I work really closely with the criminal justice system. I work closely with my colleagues in rape crisis, in women's aid. We have partnership working. We have different structures and forums within Edinburgh. And because I've been working in this area for a long time, then it's very helpful. I can tap into those support systems. We have domestic abuse court advocacy services. So if one of our students is going through the courts, then we can actually access that input and support from specialist court-led workers. So we're not just providing the service ourselves from the university. We recognise that students have a need to have external services and may not want the university to know about this. So we've set up partnership projects with rape crisis, for example, and students can refer themselves there directly and may not want the university to know. So quite a lot of work ongoing, to be honest, but I think it's very positive. There can be some criticism sometimes in the press because students, rightly, may not be happy with the outcome of what has happened in terms of telling the university, but we are trying our best. And it's a difficult area to work in because the criminal justice system is got a lot of backlog at the moment. And it's very, very difficult to gather that evidence in any sexual assault case or any domestic abuse course. So it's an ongoing process, really.
Thank you very much, Leslie. So for the second round, Javiera, is sensitization part of your work? When yes, which sensitization measures are carried out at your institution?
As I said in the previous question, one of the work services in eradication of gender violence area is the prevention and promotion of good practices throughout the community. However, this is not my role in the unit. Within the functions that compete to my role, we do carry out actions of sensitization when other units ask us about a figure that is called protection measurements, which are associated to internal legal complaints and to the protection of victims. We do this kind of work because then we can help managers and authorities to identify how they can apply measurements of support or protection to victims. So in that sort of cases, many times we must seek understanding regarding its utility. We also make actions of sensitization when we orient people about the magnitude of the problem or the reality of how the phenomenon really operates. These awareness raising actions go from helping to understand that gender violence affects the overall functionality of the person and therefore it can damage the academic or work performance, and to the fact that sometimes an affected person may be at risk only by attending to the university. Sometimes we also must dispel beliefs such as the complaints are false or that the people who report are the problem and not who are attacking those people.
Okay, thanks. And Leslie, how about you? Is sensitization part of your work? And when yes, which sensitization measures are carried out?
We work with other external bodies as well. So Red Cross Scotland, for example, have a specialist worker who actually comes into universities, and their specific role is to look at universities because it's recognised as a unique set of risks associated with being at university. The majority of sexual assaults will take place against young women between the ages of 18 and 24. And that's borne out across evidence and also in terms of police statistics and across the world. All the meta-analysis will show that that's the highest risk factor for being affected by sexual assault. So we have a cohort of high-risk, vulnerable students. So we will work with all students to say, this behaviour is not acceptable. So we put on materials around consent. We'll look at the impact of alcohol, for example, and spiking of drinks, for example. And we look at the law around consent, which is very clear that it has to be fully informed consent And if it's not, then it's considered to be a sexual assault. And if somebody is impeded by being asleep or being drunk or unable to make an informed choice, then that would be a breach of consent. So we work really closely to make sure that all genders and sexes are aware as potential victims, but also as potential perpetrators. That if somebody has sex when somebody else is very, very unconscious or very drunk or not able to give consent, then legally that could be considered as a breach of consent. And we do have cases. So we want to make sure that everybody knows, what does consent mean? Because it can be a really grey area. So we'll do lots of education to students and also to staff as well, all types of staff. And we have online training, which is great, but we need to do face-to-face training as well. And we've been doing a lot of training, particularly with our investigative teams and our specialist teams and our HR teams as well, our human resources teams, because my service also works with staff, and staff are affected by forms of gender-based violence too. So it's very complex. It can be domestic abuse, it can be, we had a forced marriage case last week, it can be rape and sexual assault, it can be childhood sexual abuse, it can be commercial sexual exploitation, it can be trafficking, it can be uploading of intimate images. So it's a whole range of, and stalking, sorry, I forgot to say stalking. Stalking and harassment is a big one. So we do lots of training about what does that look like, because it can be sometimes difficult for survivors to say, hey, I'm a victim of domestic abuse. Survivors don't say that. They don't name it in such a way. They may not understand that they are actually a victim of domestic abuse. So we'll do lots of training to raise their awareness and to make sure that they know where they can go. So everything that we do is around saying, hey, this behavior isn't acceptable. And if you're affected by this, this is where you can go. And then we're also saying, if you're perpetrating this behavior, that's not acceptable. And this is where you can go. So we'll give them advice about counselling, an organisation called Respect. And we've also got the advice place as well. So trying to make sure that the services and interventions available for anybody who's affected by forms of gender-based violence. And one of the biggest steps is to get people to recognise that they are a victim. Most people don't realise that actually that wasn't consensual, or I am a victim of domestic abuse. So it's about training people to know what is abusive and what is not, what is a healthy relationship and what is not. And that's a big job.
Thank you very much, Leslie. So thanks everyone for these rounds of discussion and hearing from you and your work. It was really great, and we want to smoothly end our session with your statements, your outro statements, and we would like to hear from all of you, what are the biggest challenges and opportunities in your field of work? And I would like to ask Catherine first.
Thanks, Heike. Well, I think obviously there are personal challenges when your day-to-day work is to provide personal support to those in your community who have experienced sexual harassment and sexual violence. And our advisors are also supporting community members who've been reported for carrying out these behaviours, and just that in itself can be very challenging on a personal level. We are a relatively new service, and we're the first of its kind in Irish higher education. And so, yes, we have policies, we have procedures, and for the most part, we can provide clarity on what's going to happen next, where it's, you know, where the next step in the process is. But there is still an aspect of the unknown in terms of how the policy might be interpreted by different players, or how the policy might stand up to legal challenge, which is obviously something that will happen when you're talking about you know, reports of sexual harassment, sexual violence. A lot of the behaviours that are reported to us are also criminal offences, and so there can be parallel investigations, and often people who have been reported for these issues have already engaged legal counsel, and that may transfer over to the process within the university. I think a great advantage to us is that we have institutional support, high level institutional support, And that allowed us to develop this bespoke training program, and it allowed us to embed it in the kind of supports available to students as they enter the university. And we have a very high rate for incoming students completing this training. And as a service, we're working with societies to ensure that continuing members who are in student leadership roles, like society auditors, treasurers, committee members, are all taking this training. However, there are still challenges with regard to achieving the participation in the training that we will need in order to achieve the kind of culture change that we want. So a lot of my work next trimester will be going around to school meetings and speaking to faculty and showing them the participation rates and calling out the participation rates in their own school or college in comparison to others to try and get those participation rates up. And you know, the participation rates in the training from female employees is higher than males, and so it's also in particular areas it's higher in others. So we have higher participation rates in social sciences, social justice than we do, for example, in medicine. So in some cases you feel you're preaching to those who are already quite well formed in this area, so it is a challenge to address that in other areas and to get men involved in supporting this training and undertaking it. I think a huge advantage to us in UCD is that we're a campus-based university with a strong community. So our communications campaign, I think, has been very successful because we are, you know, there's 33,000 people here. We are a town. And our collateral is very visible in this community. So just the very nature of our university being a campus-based university has been an advantage to us. And I think that the data collecting mechanisms that we've been able to develop is also you know, is also a great help to us. We're getting to the point now, it's our second year in the Dignity and Respect Support Service, where we can see where and when particular behaviours might be likely to occur. For example, you know, we can pinpoint the residents over the Christmas break as being maybe a pinch point for these behaviours, and so we'll be able to target in communications and training into those areas. So I think that's a great opportunity for us, and I think you know, the more we work in this area, the more information we gather will allow us to target those specific supports. Yeah, and that's a great opportunity for us.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Pater, what can you share with us concerning challenges and opportunities, please?
Thank you, Heike. I think one of the key challenges that we face is to convince the community at large, whether they are colleagues and peers or student body or the administration, that the problem is real and that there is a particular scale to the problem, that it is a large scale problem. It's not something that is small or minor. Because as you also saw during the panel discussion that we had when you visited us a few weeks ago, there is either a tendency to dismiss it as a minor problem, or there is also this other tendency to say that this is all blown up and that the laws and policies are actually discriminatory against men or misused against men and so on. So in this context, it's very important, as some of the other panelists also have said, to collect a lot of data, to carry out substantial research. So while India and our institute has a very strong tradition of activism and of speaking out against sexual harassment and violence, that has not contributed to reducing the scale of victimization of women, especially, and in universities as well. And I think one of the key issues is the lack of adequate quality and quantity of data to show the scale of sexual harassment and violence in universities. And here is where there is a need for institutions themselves, that is universities, but also the gender and women's cells that have been constituted to address sexual harassment, for them to do a lot of research with the kind of data that they have from looking at a lot of complaints of sexual harassment. So I think the challenges are in terms of doing research, getting adequate quality of data, getting funds to support research on sexual harassment and violence. That is something that is quite substantial, and we've made a small beginning in different parts of India through collaborative research, but we have a long way to go. And this, I think, can also help us to get in other stakeholders, the media, for example, or the political class, to start discussing these issues, so that that is then taken seriously by university leaders and leadership. As far as opportunities are concerned, on the one hand, we have increasing awareness and consciousness, especially, as I said, among the senior graduate students, but also younger faculty members. And this is translating into more organizations, especially universities, putting in place mandatory gender sensitization programs and programs against sexual harassment. So there a lot more institutions do this compared to 10 years ago. But what it also means is that a lot of them need formal training in this area. So the awareness does not necessarily translate into a capacity to provide good quality training on gender sensitization and prevention of sexual harassment. And there is also linkage to research here, because what we see is that while certain sections of the university, like faculty and students, are covered by the gender cell, by the institute complaints committee, and by the legal procedures, there are huge sections who are left out, especially workers who are on a contract basis, project staff who are hired on a temporary basis. The problems of the non-teaching employees are quite unique and different from that of faculty. So there is a need to have a better understanding of particular sections of the university population who also are affected by sexual harassment of particular kinds, and which are very difficult to address using the conventional way of understanding sexual harassment and violence. And this is also because they face particular kinds of power inequalities which are not addressed in the legal and formal procedures when it comes to sexual harassment. So there is an opportunity here to do more research and design better quality strategies for addressing sexual harassment. The other opportunity that I wish to briefly mention is that there is a small but very vocal demand for more training programs and more awareness programs as far as sexual harassment and violence is concerned. And this is coming from the very sections that I spoke about earlier: temporary workers, contract workers, workers who are at the receiving end of power inequalities, the housekeeping staff, for example, who especially been affected a lot by sexual harassment and violence. So I think there is a scope, and there is also scope for, as we have seen, students taking up the case of some of these non-unionized staff members who face sexual harassment and violence. So these cross-cutting alliances provide new opportunities for learning more about sexual harassment and violence in universities, but also designing strategies to better deal with that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pata. Very interesting. So Dan, what can you tell us about challenges and opportunities?
I tell you, the day that I just do it perfectly will be a red letter day. There are many challenges and opportunities, and I think every challenge is an opportunity, to be frank. I think in relation to our university, I think what we've done well is to get a whole of institutional backing for a gendered violence policy. And I think having a policy that everyone can turn to for definition, for process is a really important, it's a really important initiative. And I think the fact that the policy directly feeds from our strategy, the gender violence strategy that we developed last year, that provides an opportunity for us to be much more consistent in what we're doing and for everyone to come on board, because I think that's the key, not just senior leadership, although that I think is central to anything succeeding, but for everyone to know about it. And it was interesting, I'm not sure which one of my colleagues mentioned communications, but I think if one thing that we have done very badly is communicate really terrific initiatives with the rest of the university. And one of the best examples I can give you is that we've had an excellent response with our enterprise agreement and opportunities for staff, and no one knew about it in relation to DV leave and flexible work arrangements. And it's a little bit the same as with what we're doing now for sexual harassment and sexual violence. We've got excellent training. We have face-to-face training, online training for different, and it's always tailored to very particular business units to make sure it's fit for purpose. We've got great online modules, learning modules, and again, fit for purpose. But unless people know about it, you can have great products, great initiatives, great work, and it's almost like it's othered. It's something a bit different. And so the university has to, I think, own it and really make sure that people are aware of their responsibilities and the opportunities to make a complaint or to make a report. And I suppose if there's one challenge that I think we haven't cracked, it would be, what is the difference between a report and a complaint? Is it, you know, are we allowing people who have had any experience of sexual violence, whether it's related to the campus or not, to come and access our services? Because staff will be affected and students will want some special consideration if they've experienced sexual harassment in a different workplace or in, you know, outside of the context of the university. It still affects their capacity to do their job or to complete their studies. So to what extent do we communicate to people that, you know, we think that sexual violence and gendered violence more holistically is not acceptable, and it's something that they can come, they can discuss, and they can seek some assistance, some compassionate help and care to ensure that they can stay in their position or in their program of study. I think the other thing that I would like us to think more about is, how do we support people who are alleged perpetrators? You know, we're not a court. We're not there to determine guilt or innocence. It is reasonable for us to make determinations on the basis of likely probabilities. But until we have evidence that there is a likely probability, that person remains often in a situation where they're not supported, where procedural fairness can feel as if it's being denied. And one of the things that I've observed time and time again is that where there's not support for both the person affected and the person who is alleged to have breached codes of conduct, is that students line up against one another, staff line up against one another, people take sides. And so I guess managing that kind of tension would be, I think we need to explore that a little more. And also alternatives to looking at guilt innocence, but around, you know, mediation and restorative justice. Because I think very often when I've spoken to people affected, very often all they want is an apology and a guarantee that it won't happen again. But sometimes if you go down a complaint route, people won't apologise because they're not going to give any admission of guilt, and you end up with a standoff, and it becomes so procedurally and administratively driven that it's not helpful for anyone. So really some more research and some more practice-based research where we look and see what models can be implemented in a university setting. The other thing, we've undertaken quite a lot of evidence reviews trying to work out what is best practice internationally. And to be frank, we talk about prevention, but rarely are we talking about the same thing. And I don't think that there's good evidence that we do know how to prevent in a meaningful way. So I would like to see more work done in that space and to evaluate what we're doing. I think like at UNSW, we have done a lot of work, and I think some really good work, but it still is standing in the aisles waiting to be evaluated, to know what did we do well, what should we be doing more of, what should we perhaps not be doing. So I think evaluation for all of us would be a really important step, and also publishing the findings so that, you know, all of us can learn from one another in different cultural contexts, different countries, different administrative structures. I think for me, the last thing I really want to say is, if we're serious about responding to sexual violence, I think universities have to develop and properly resource all prevention and response activities. I think we can no longer sit back and beg. We have to be demanding that resourcing. I also think that the whole of community or university, whole of university response is what we should be aiming for, but it's got to be genuine and it's got to be championed by senior leadership. And most importantly, co-designed with students and staff. And I think we've got to tailor our prevention activities. I think so often we have this blunt approach, and for example, an LGBTIQ plus student may not understand some of the messages around consent in the same way as a heterosexual cis student might understand it. So for both staff and students, I think tailored prevention activities are important. But if I was thinking about response, a last word on response, I think a good practice response has to be inclusive, and inclusive of all different university staff and students, and trauma informed. And I'm not assuming that everyone is traumatised, but a trauma informed response is one that involves all of the organisation being on the same page. And it means we don't ask what's wrong with a person, but instead we ask what has happened to this person. So we shift our way of thinking from pathologising to trying to understand the context of their experience. And I think compassionate and effective responses have to be extended to all university members who've experienced sexual violence. I don't think we can keep only looking at sexual violence or gendered violence where it occurs within the context of the university. I think any staff member, any student has a right to really expect a compassionate and trauma-informed response to something that's happened to them. If we're serious about really responding to gendered violence in a holistic way, I think that's really, really important. And I know that I'm not alone, because I heard one of my other colleagues say this. All responses should aim to keep staff productively in their employment and students productively in their enrolled program of study. So that's really it for me, but there's so much more to say. It's such a wide topic, and there are so many great initiatives. You know, we're really just touching the surface, I think, in this webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Jen, for bringing up these points. You're right. There's vast experience out there. Wendy, how about you, and what are you facing in terms of challenges and opportunities?
Every challenge is an opportunity, Jen just said, and I want to copy that, because it gives us a positive outlook, and I think this is very important in this field of work that we do, on sexual harassment and violence. When I think of the personal level, when I, for example, work as a counselor and have to do a lot with victims, survivors, I think this is just difficult work to cope with. And you go home and you have situations in your head that have been awful, and where the help that you can offer is just very limited. I think that's frustrating, and that's just very challenging for me and for other counselors, of course. What adds to that is often the fact that the people that come to our counseling, they want to be listened to, they want to be empowered to, but they don't want to file a complaint or do anything on an official basis, which I totally understand, because the structures are just so so few and so non-supportive, and you don't know what was going to happen. There's no transparency, and there are all kinds of fears. But still inside, there's sometimes a feeling, well, I want to do something. I need this voice in order to change something. But of course, we need to accept that that we need to respect the wishes and stay confidential. I mentioned this before. We need transparent procedures. We need clear responsibilities. We need resources. We need mandates. We need more professionalization for counselors, for people who take complaints, for everyone who is involved somehow in cases of sexual harassment. A lot of training is needed, and a lot of workshops, a lot of discussions and get-togethers. We need to keep research on this topic, which we used to have for the last years, but the funding is not clear whether there will be enough funding to keep research ongoing, which is so important, so needed. But yeah, so we have these unsafe conditions that some of you also mentioned when it comes to resources. We have some people, some points where there's a lot of action, where there's a lot of dedication, but hardly any of this is stable, it's ongoing. So we don't know how the future will be. And I think this is a real challenge that, that we have to live at the moment with this insecurity. Still, I would say what is needed the most, though, is more general. And I would say it is knowledge about the dynamics of power relations and about the effects of sexual harassment and violence, and about the suffering and the consequences for victim survivors and everyone involved. This is a prerequisite, and I see that this knowledge is among a lot of members of the university. And but it is needed, and this understanding is needed. It is needed that we deal with a large-scale problem, with a structural problem, and before actually we can do more strategic work, we need to get this knowledge across, which allows for more awareness and for understanding, and then actually to tackle this problem. And so we're on this level, I think, where we need more knowledge and more dedication. What are opportunities? All of the challenges are opportunities. This was said before. I think we have now a good time, a time where there are movements outside of our university, inside, where students pressure for this topic, where students, especially students, also employees, but I think the most initiatives come from students, which say, well, this is not okay, something needs to happen. Why is there no one I can turn to? Why does the university doesn't do anything? So we have more and more pressure. In my observation, it has really become more over the last years. And I think this is good. We can use it. We can also use the pressure from the press when cases are discussed in the press, because this is just pressure on our universities to do something, to take this seriously. And so I would say we have these kind of opportunities that come from movements, as I said, inside and outside the university.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you very much. Leslie, what kind of challenges and opportunities do you see?
We can finish on a kind of positive note. The challenges are, as I mentioned before, it's about managing expectations. And it's about dealing with people who may have been affected by different forms of abuse at different points in their lives. So what we call complex trauma and the relationship with mental health issues as well. We have high levels of people who are affected by mental health issues and anxiety, depression, self-harming, etc. So it's a very kind of complex bi-directional relationship between abuse and between alcohol and substance misuse, etc. So we're trying to change that culture. We're trying to say, look, it's okay if you're self-medicating. It's okay if you're taking alcohol or drugs to cope with this. But what we want to do is we want to change that culture, and we want to say it's not okay for this to happen. And Edinburgh University has been criticised in the press recently because some students have considered that we haven't come down hard enough on people who've been accused of forms of sexual assault and sexual abuse. So we've reviewed the code of conduct, we're doing more training, we're working with student bodies to try and say, actually, this is what we have to do within the laws of the Scottish jurisdiction. We can't just throw people out. We have to have some form of evidence. So it is about changing that culture, and that can take a while. The positive thing is again about changing that culture, because we have a very well-educated, well-informed cohort of young people who are going to go out into the world and who hopefully will take this message with them into their employment, into their workplaces, back into their countries, wherever they've come from. And they'll say, hey, I remember doing a course at Edinburgh University and it's not acceptable to speak to people like that or to behave like that. So it's about changing that mindset, and hopefully in the future we'll reduce the levels of abuse on campus, but also within the wider community as well.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you very much. Javiera, last round goes to you. What are your challenges and opportunities you see?
About the challenges and opportunities, I can say that the main challenge we face sometimes is institutional resistance, mobilized by conservative ideology inserted in some parts of the institution. This situation generates concrete expression of obstruction of change and a lack of support for victims. Although significant progress has been observed in the institutionalization of gender issues since the feminist movement of 2018, I think that now we can observe a response manifested through actions like, for example, questioning the importance of the issue or considering that it is not a priority. It is also observed in the intention to ghettoize the issue, thus preventing these changes from being widespread. In the same sense, the main opportunity of work that I identify lies in the people and units who care about the subject and understand what gender approach is, because they become stakeholders for us that improves equality. They pressure for the stop of violence in their communities and request support when it's needed, collaborating to create solutions. Those people and university units identify that equality is desirable, and that, for example, they provide adequate support to victims. This improves case management prognosis, accelerate the arrival of help, and create a less hostile environment for those who have experienced situations of violence or gender discrimination. ultimately, these people contribute to the restoration of equity lost due to violence. And in that sense, being able to identify these actors and promote articulated work is key, since ultimately people and communities give life to institutional management.
Thank you very much, Javiera, and thanks to all of you for being part of this roundtable. It was a pleasure to listen to you, to discuss with you, to hear what you do, what your institutions are at, and I think it was very interesting to have like the different insights here, and I hope we can learn from each other. I definitely learned something, and I have to say that I go out from this roundtable with a lot of hope, because I saw what is possible at institutions, and that really gives me hope. So thank you so much.